Hello, everyone. This is Andy Nowicki, aka the Nameless One, and this is the latest Nameless podcast. Every movement has its good and bad aspects, its strengths and its weaknesses, and the alt-right movement, of which I am tangentially, in some insignificant way, a part of, is no different. And I always find it kind of boring to talk about how we're right and they're wrong, and the in-group out-group kind of vibe that we see among some other commentators. It's never really been my thing. I guess I'm somewhat of a contrarian nature, although hopefully not someone who's contrarian just for the sake of being contrary. I'll let my listeners decide about that, whether that's true or not. Still, being in this movement, again, to whatever degree that I am, to whatever extent that I could be said to be someone who is a part of this movement, and I know some of you probably wouldn't think of me that way anyway, but seeing things from the inside, I have come up with certain things that I think are worth critiquing, certain ways in which there's a general perspective on things that's just been somewhat lazily, sloppily employed, and that I want to challenge. Now, I'm going to talk about three things, and I know that what makes me vulnerable with regard to all three of these arguments or perspectives, ways of thinking, I wouldn't even say that they're arguments, they're prejudices, they're presuppositions, they're ways of thinking that lie beneath arguments, but generally remain unchallenged or unthought of in a lot of cases. I know that in bringing up all three of these things, I'm vulnerable to the counter challenge that these are just things that I'm talking about because I happen to feel differently than this mainstream way of thinking among the alt-right. And that may well be true. In fact, it is true. I am on the minority side in all three of these aspects of the alt-right common perspective. But I would like to think that those who disagree with me, those who are on the other side in all three of these cases, can at least see this as an honest challenge and not just me being a dick and being a contrarian for the sake of contrariness. I am perfectly willing to be a part of a movement that's a broad movement, and I'm perfectly willing to be a minority voice in a lot of ways in this movement, just because, as I've said before, the forces that we're all united against, this juggernaut that we all oppose, is something that we need all the allies we can get in our fight against, and that is the mainstream way of thinking employed by anti-white multiculturalists and feminists and homosexualists and liberal lefties and cult Marxists and so forth. Number one, the first challenge to the alt-right, the first alt-right myth that I would like to explode, is the idea that Christianity is simply a Jewish plot to undermine the West, to fill the white man's head with cultural rot, with the slave morality, and so forth, and so take him down. Now, the reason why I say this is a myth isn't just because isn't at all, I don't think, because I am Christian myself, specifically Catholic. It's because it simply makes no sense if you look at it historically. Looking at the broad swath of history, in the 2,000 plus years since the birth of Jesus, and the emergence of the early church, and then the adoption of Christianity by Rome in the 4th century, eventually the development of the church in the early and medieval times, on through to the present. In all of that time, where Christianity has been, generally speaking, the mainstream faith of the West, in all of that time, there has been no multiculturalism, no interest in bringing in the alien and swamping the West with foreign elements because the white man is evil and we have to will ourselves out of existence because of the evil that we've committed and all that swill that we hear about today. That has never been a part of the church until, 40 years ago, 50 years ago at most, at a time when faith was already eroding from the Western mind. That was when we saw the emergence of radical racial egalitarianism and multiculturalism, and eventually the idea that it was just wrong to exclude the racial other from the political West, that was just unchristian or whatever. Now, in the last 50 years, of course, this kind of rhetoric has been heard from churchmen, and it's been heard from people who consider themselves not just Christian, but ultra-Christian, and who say, look, if you're not in favor of mass immigration, then you are unchristian, right? That's become the prevalent, in some quarters anyway, that's become the prevalent mode of thought among Western Christians. But that simply reflects the general attitude in the West, the general anti-white, self-hatred, ethno-masochist vibe that's out there. And I would argue it has absolutely nothing to do with the Christian faith. And as evidence, I would say, look, the Christian faith has been around in the West not just for centuries, but for millennia, for almost 2 millennia. It's been the dominant, the prevalent faith of the West for, let's say, a millennia and a half, 1,500 years. That's a long, long time. In that whole span of time, there was never a breath of this idea, this notion that we need to mix everybody together, that if the white man has his own society over here and the black man has his over here or the yellow man has his over here and so forth, that's just wrong, wrong, wrong. That was never believed in all the history of the faith. There was never even a hint, never even an indication of that kind of belief until very, very recently, when, as I said before, faith had already begun to erode in the West. Now, has Christianity always had a universal perspective in some ways? Yes. Christianity has always seen the radical equality of man before God. And in the Christian faith, there is neither slave nor free, Gentile nor Jew, male nor female, white nor black, in the sense that we're all created in God's image. Yes, that has always been a part of the faith. And if that offends you, then Christianity is not for you, obviously. But I'm not even taking on the question of whether Christianity is right or wrong, or whether paganism is right or wrong. If I were a pagan or an atheist, I would just as easily make this observation, and it seems so obvious that it boggles my mind that it's not seen more readily. And I can only suspect that there is some intellectual skullduggery, some intellectual dishonesty from those who advance this perspective. Now, I said before, I'm refuting the idea that Christianity was a Jewish plot to undermine to sap the strength of the white man, the vital pagan strength of the white man. I am not advancing any particular perspective on the Jews. I'm not opening that can of worms again. I'm just exploding this whole idea, this whole notion of Christianity as something that's inherently anti-white, because it obviously isn't. White nations thrived under Christianity for centuries and centuries. Now, that is not to say, again, that Christianity is correct. I'm not making that argument. I'm not taking on that argument here. I'm not saying anything. Obviously, I am a Christian, so I'm not claiming to be completely impartial, but I am just looking at history impartially, and I think that this would apply whatever my personal faith were. This is just common sense. This is just looking at history and making certain observations. So if you're going to be a pagan, then be a pagan, and if you're going to be bothered or offended by the notion that you are in some ways the spiritual brother of those of other races, then go ahead. I'm not saying, I disagree, but I'm not taking on that issue right now. I'm not trying to argue you out of that perspective, because you are correct to see that as part of Christianity. But you are incorrect to see Christianity as something that's inherently destructive to the white race, or something that was set up to undermine the racial integrity of the white man. Because if it was set up that way, it sure did a lousy job of it, again, for 2,000 years just about. And it just happened to start having that effect when the church was already in real trouble and secularization was proceeding rapidly in the West, and fewer people were calling themselves Christian than ever before in the history of Christendom. So there you go. And if you want to say, well, okay, it wasn't a Jewish plot to undermine the West, but it had the effect of undermining the West, and it did derive out of Judaism. Well, you're right that it came out of Judaism. That's historically undeniable. But if it has had the effect of undermining the West, then why didn't it immediately have that effect? Why did the West thrive? Why was there not ever a whisper of, oh, we're so evil because we're white? Of course, in the medieval days, that nobody really thought in those terms. But there was an awareness of nationality. There was an awareness of being of a certain kin, and so forth. And that was an identity that was similar to racial identity. And again, no trace of that at any point in the early days of the church, in the medieval age, when the church reigned supreme. Nothing of that sort ever after the Protestant Reformation, again, where there were different visions of Christendom, but still a general uniformity of belief in the Christian faith among those of the cultural West. No, this only started, again, when the erosion of Christianity started to happen in the late 50s, early 60s, into the 70s, and into the wonderful postmodern age in which we all have the blighted misfortune to live today. All right, so that's myth number one. Alt-right myth number two that I would like to challenge is this. It's often said, it's such a shame that the National Socialist Germans and the Italian fascists lost the war, because if they would have won the war, then we wouldn't be facing the kind of circumstances that we're facing today. There wouldn't be this existential danger from mass third world immigration, from the flinging open of the floodgates and asking the non-Western world to come on in, because it would really be evil for us to put any limit on how many of them can enter our country, and there's no real such thing as national sovereignty, and so forth. And we should all get on our hands and knees and beg for forgiveness for all the great evil that we've done in our history as the white race, and be aware of ourselves as the cancer of history, and work to our own demise. None of that would have happened, the argument goes, if World War II had gone differently. Now that is, again, very sloppy thinking. Let me explain why. When World War II broke out, the whole idea of importing third worlders to the West, of opening the floodgates and letting them all come in, and the whole notion of white guilt and of white self-hatred, that was nowhere to be found in the West. Now, those of you who focus on Jewish subversion, you're correct to notice that a lot of Bolsheviks, an extremely high number of card-carrying Bolsheviks, were Jewish. Yes, that is true. But nobody in Bolshevik Russia or in the democratic West, or of course in among the Axis powers, fascist Italy or Nazi Germany, or Imperial Japan, none of them were talking about the prospect of mass third world immigration. None of them were floating the idea of white guilt. And you didn't hear that kind of rhetoric from Jews at that time. That was not in the air. It was not in the atmosphere. It was not what the war was being fought over. If you had asked any of the people fighting the war, from the lowest ranked privates to the most powerful guys on the top, pulling the strings on either side, nobody would say a thing about racial integration. No one would say a thing about mass third world immigration. These were not concepts that anybody was talking about, anybody of any import was talking about at that time. These were not ideas that animated the war. Basically, by today's standards, everybody was a racist, because they all pretty much thought of their countries as white. Of course, in America, there were blacks and a few others who lived in America who were Americans. But among most of Europe, that was not the case. And in Russia, Soviet Russia, that was certainly not the case. And nobody wanted it to be the case. Nobody was saying, we've got to fight this war so that in the future we'll be free to unleash the third world horde on the white West. That's just nonsense. That was not the mentality. All right, so then the war ended. After the war ended in 1945, from 1945 until, let's say, the mid-60s, there was still no real motion to flood the West with the racial other or as any kind of moral imperative. Now, in the 50s, there was the civil rights movement in the South, which involved blacks in the South, standing up against what they saw as certain injustices. But the civil rights movement in the South involving American blacks did not constitute any kind of existential threat to the overwhelming white identity of the West. It just didn't. There was no relationship there. So it was only in the mid to late 60s that we started to see the hint of something along these lines, when immigration laws were changed in a way that would welcome to Western countries, especially England and America and eventually others, these people of other races. And even at first, it wasn't with the idea that eventually, we've got to swamp the West with these other kinds of people because the white man is so evil, right? That whole notion, this whole irrational ethno-masochistic white guilt, really took a while to take hold, and it's only really taken hold during my lifetime. I'm 44. But I can remember back in the early 80s, there really wasn't that much of it. It wasn't that prevalent or powerful at all. In the mid 80s, there was in Georgia, the state that I lived in, there was still a very overwhelming number of citizens who were in favor of keeping the Confederate flag logo in the state flag. And as a teenage liberal, I chafed against those rednecks, who wanted to do this, but they weren't going anywhere, and they were the majority, and don't mess with them. That was, they were the primary voting bloc. They were the primary cultural force in the South. Still, we're talking in the 80s. So it's only been really slowly, well, not that slowly, but fairly recently, that things have gotten to the ridiculous extreme that they've gotten now in the West, where even opposing any kind of immigration, or saying we need to have quotas, we need to keep if we're going to have immigrants, they should be of a certain identity, prevalently speaking, that whole where even that is stigmatized and criminalized, and if you believe that, then you're a really, really, really bad person. That's the way it is now, but it wasn't that way not so long ago. So it doesn't have anything to do with how World War II turned out, is what I'm saying. The people who fought against the Nazis and the fascists in World War II, they were not fighting for that reason. That wasn't the reason that the people in charge, who were, we could say, behind the war on either side, encouraging the fight for their own reasons. Their reasons, unless, it's off somewhere in some super secret tomb or vault in Bohemian Grove, or among the skull and bones men of Yale, or somewhere else, some other super secret cryptic site, or among the nefarious plotters of the Elders of Zion. Again, those of you who focus on the Jewish role in the way that things have unfolded, it's important to note that among the communist nations, where Bolshevism, which again we agree was disproportionately Jewish in its leadership, where Bolshevism won the day and Soviet Russia expanded into Eastern Europe and took over, and the Iron Curtain fell, right? Among Bolshevism, again, not ruled by Jews, I won't say that, but definitely disproportionately Jewish. Well, in the East, in the White East, there was absolutely nothing. No hint, no whisper of any kind of third world immigration. Now you would think that if the way that the war turned out, if the war was fought over the destiny of the white race and the ability of the white man to have his own sovereignty in the world, if that was the reason why it was fought, and the Germans were pro-white and the Allies were anti-white, and the Allies and communists were anti-white, and the anti-whites won the day. If that's what you're arguing, if that's the way you see World War II, then ask yourself, why in the East was there absolutely no hint of third world immigration for longer than that was true in the West? In the West, that started to crumble in the mid to late 60s, and progressed or regressed through the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But in the East, there was no immigration at all. There was no notion of third world immigration. There was no notion that the white man needed to be enriched by his swarthier, darker brothers and sisters in Africa and Asia and so forth. That was never implemented in any communist country amongst, again, these nations that inherit the legacy of Soviet Bolshevism. Some of you would call Jewish Bolshevism, right? That did not happen until the fall of communism. Communism fell in the late 80s, and then in the 90s there was more of a whisper of that. And today, of course, it's the momentum has built even in the East, even in Russia itself. There's a large Muslim population that lives there now, and of course, with the so-called migrant crisis, or whatever you want to call it, unfolding, that's all taking place in Eastern Europe. But that has no relationship to World War II. That has no relationship to who won or who lost World War II. In fact, the victors of World War II stayed white, right? If they were so anti-white, you think that they would have invited all of the third worlders to come in immediately, flung open the floodgates. But or if they wanted to do it gradually, like the pig in the boiling pot, that overused metaphor. If they wanted to do it that way, then they would have started to introduce it a little bit, and then a little bit more, and then a little bit more. But that didn't happen. It wasn't happening at all. It was not a priority. It was not on anybody's mind. So, obviously, the way the war turned out doesn't have any relationship to what's happening now. No obvious one, certainly. Now, if you want to say that, if the Axis powers had won the day in Europe, then they would still be around today, and there would be a robust pro-Aryan, pro-white kind of perspective, and they would never allow what's happening in Europe to happen if that ideology were still ascendant. Well, maybe not. See, the thing about history is you don't know. Now, if the Nazis had won, and if Hitler had decided against his foolhardy plan to invade Russia, let's say he just decided to take most of Europe and have that be that, and then you have the Third Reich ascendant in Europe. That does not mean that the hardcore racialists are going to rule the day forever. Of course, the whole idea, the dream, was for a 1,000-year Reich, and it turned out to be just a 12-year Reich. But let's say it managed to be a little bit longer than that. It managed to last a little bit longer than 12 years. If, again, Hitler had fought more prudently and cut his losses, or quit while he was ahead, I guess is the better way to say it. There's still no telling what would have happened after that. Now, some of you out there might like to think that there's no way the German spirit, the indomitable spirit of National Socialism, would have been undermined, could have been undermined. But look, it happened in the Soviet Union. It happened in the East. They got undermined. They eventually came up against Western hedonism, and that led to the undoing of the Soviet Union and its satellite states. So how do you know that wouldn't have happened among the Nazi Union of Europe? How do you know that the 60s wouldn't have taken place in Nazi Europe, and the new crop of high-ranking members of the regime, if maybe they wouldn't have decided, well, you know what, we need to adapt with the times, and National Socialism is good, yes, and we honor our ancestors and blah, 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 and the generations who fought and died before us, but we need a new regime for a new time. And, you know, we need to find accommodation with the spirit of the times. How do you know that that wouldn't have happened? You don't. Nobody does. Okay? And so that's the other side of the coin. One reason why I'm saying that this whole idea that, you know, oh, it's so terrible that the Allies won and the Axis lost World War II, leaving out where I stand on the Allies and the Axis, you know, from a moral perspective. I've talked about this before, that I generally think both sides were pretty awful. And, you know, to quote our old friend Henry Kissinger, it was a shame that they both couldn't lose, especially the Nazis and the Soviets, because they were both totalitarian, brutal regimes. And, of course, the Allied West was certainly far from being morally unspotted in the way they fought the war and their motivations for fighting the war and so forth as well. But I'm putting all that aside for now and just looking at the question, was it really a shame? Was it really a tragedy that the Nazis lost because third world immigration, which is the way I hear the matter put often these days, and it simply does not follow, because number one, there was no anti-white upshot of the Allies winning and the Axis losing. Anything anti-white that happened, the whole anti-white movement, the momentum towards white self-hatred and ethnomasochism that we see really taking hold today, that has no particular bearing on the outcome of World War II. Yes, a racist regime was defeated, so I guess you could say there's that. But beyond that, there again, like I was saying, both sides, all nations fighting in the war were quote-unquote racist by today's standards. And nothing obvious from the war led to any kind of momentum towards the anti-white zeitgeist that prevails today. So there's that aspect of it, and there's also this tendency to, among some of y'all out there, not among the mainstream. If anybody from the mainstream is listening to this, obviously that doesn't apply to any of you, I wouldn't think. But among the alt-right, there are plenty of people out there who would say, or who don't even say, who just think, who just, without even thinking, just assume that things would have been hunky-dory afterwards, and there would have been, for Germany, from the German, you know, Aryan race ascendant, dominant sort of perspective, that would have prevailed and gone on prevailing among the putative Nazi empire, when in fact the Nazi empire could just as easily have been subverted as the Western world was subverted, as that is to say, the countries that constituted the Allied powers as well as the Axis powers has been subverted. I mean, maybe it was going to happen anyway. It's kind of analogously speaking, it's similar to thinking as a traditionalist Catholic about Vatican II and the liberalization of the church and all of the problems that followed that we see to this day, evidence of a Catholic Church in crisis with our current Pope, and so forth. It can all trace back to Vatican II, but on the other hand, maybe this liberalization was going to take place anyway, and maybe Vatican II really didn't have much to do with whether or not it was going to take place. We simply don't know. That's the thing. We can guess, we can make conjectures, but we don't know for sure, and to behave as if, oh yes, this is the way it would have been, is simply naive. Number 3. This is a less heady topic than the other two, but it's one I want to cover just a little bit to wrap things up today. And that is the third perspective that I want to challenge, that is dominant among alt-writers, among a significant portion of alt-writers, a significant faction, maybe even the majority, is that if you are a white person who's not a race traitor, who's not ashamed of being white, that you should not have anything to do with watching sports that are black dominated. So if you are a white guy who likes your college football, let's say, or you like your NBA basketball, or if you like baseball and you like to see those Latin players play, and you can admire the athleticism of people who are outside of your race, and doesn't bother you, it doesn't trouble you, then you are nothing but a quote race cuck. And I use that word cuck in quotes because you know how I feel about the whole cuck-servative cuck thing. But the argument goes, if you're a true white advocate, then you shouldn't be enjoying watching people of other races play sports. Now, I think this is silly, but here it's more of a judgment call. It's more of an aesthetic question rather than referring to historical truths, as I have done with the first two alt-right myths that I have attempted to explode. In this case, I would simply say a lot of y'all have drawn attention to Jesse Owens and the 1936 Berlin Olympics and this pernicious myth that Jesse Owens, who was a black sprinter who won a few gold medals that year in 1936, that he was somehow snubbed and treated shabbily by the Nazis because he was black. That's the myth, and of course it isn't true. The truth is that the Germans were courteous and respectful of Jesse Owens as they were of other non-white athletes, and they were celebrated by Leni Riefenstahl when she made her movie about the 1936 Olympics. And so if the Nazis could be nice to black athletes and appreciate black athletes and, celebrate their athleticism and so forth, it's like you guys want to be more hardcore than the Nazis were. On the one hand, you correctly want to say, yes, it's totally wrong what you're saying about the Nazis and Jesse Owens and others. But on the other hand, you want to say to the contemporary Jesse Owens and other athletes of non-white origin, you not only cast aspersions against them or use racial slurs to talk about them, and I'm not talking about the ones who are thuggy and annoying and talk themselves up, and there are plenty of elements of black culture that seep into sports that I don't enjoy particularly. But there's nothing about the idea of a black athlete or a non-white athlete. There's nothing inherently about appreciating him as an athlete that means you're a race traitor. But some of you, again, want to not only speak in crude and unmannerly ways about non-white athletes, but you also want to categorize white people who enjoy watching sports that are played by non-whites, predominantly by non-whites. You want to categorize them as race traitors or race cucks or whatever you want to call them. So you have to see the contradiction there, right? If the Germans were wrong about, if people are wrong, if it was a complete lie, and it was, to say that the Germans were mean to Jesse Owens, that they treated him well, and that you admire the spirit that animated the courteousness with which Jesse Owens was treated in 1936. But you also want to say, look at these race cucks who like to watch nigger ball and blah, 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 blah. I mean, if that's the rhetoric you want to use for people who enjoy sports, you are contradicting yourself. If you don't like sports, that's fine. And, I'm a mild sports fan. Again, like with all of these things, I'm obviously in the minority. Here, I mean, I enjoy watching some sports, and I don't have any problem with enjoying black athletes. Of course, it's always fun and always interesting when you see someone white excel in a predominantly black sport, and I think that's fine. That's exciting, and I think that's permissible to have a pride in somebody who comes from your own type of background, who's making it in a sport where he does not, generally speaking, predominate. But on the other hand, there's nothing inherently wrong about enjoying watching sports played by non-whites. And it doesn't mean that you're ashamed to be white. It doesn't mean that at all. And there's something really irksome about the ideologizing of aesthetics. The whole idea that if you like this particular type of sport, or if you like this movie, or if you like this book, or if you like something else that's not seen as ideologically pure, then you should cease to like it. And you should like something else that is more ideologically pure. There's something about that entire perspective that's just sheer priggery. It's priggery. It's liking something not because you like it, but because you're supposed to like it. And that's silly to me in all of its forms. I say like what you're going to like, and that's a big part of my problem with political correctness, which is what has flung me in the alt-right camp in the first place, because they say, oh no, you can't like this, this is bad, this is racist, this is sexist, this is homophobic, and if you enjoy watching this, then there's something wrong with you and you need to be re-educated. Well, I don't stand for that, and I don't stand for the flip side of that either, where it's like, oh, you can't enjoy watching the NFL because it's 70% black. You should enjoy ice hockey because it's 98% white. I don't have any problem with ice hockey, but it's not what I grew up with. I didn't watch it as a kid, and I'm not going to take it up just to try to train myself into being more aesthetically acceptable. That's just silly. Okay, this is a much more minor thing, but still something that gets under my skin a little bit, under my very white skin. So I wanted to mention it as well. Okay, and number 4, y'all say degeneracy too much. Start using a different word, and I'm calling for a moratorium on degeneracy. as a term, a favored term of the alt-right. Now, I've been guilty of using it before myself. I think it's even been in the title of articles that I've written, but we need to try a little harder and be a little bit more imaginative. All right. So I'll end on that note. This is the degenerate nameless one, Andy Nowicki, signing off. Thank you all for listening. Talk to y'all later.